very kind, thank you. So I have one laptop here that's doing the slides, and then one laptop here that's doing the speaker's notes. So I'll try and sort of keep it all in sync. So I haven't worked for Monzo for very long, but one of the really gratuitous things you can do as a speaker in London is to ask how many people here have a Monzo card. So could you put your hands up? Okay, that feels really good. So yeah, those in the US, we recently just launched there as well. So everyone that's on the Zoom, you can also sign up. So fundamentally, Monzo is trying to build a new type of bank. Basically a bank that you would build from first principles in 2019. So think running on the cloud, microservices, data warehouses, et cetera, et cetera. So we now have over 2 million customers that have current accounts. I've been working there for a little over 3 months. Before this, I was working for my own startup that did essentially kind of credit card fraud. Well, not committing credit card fraud, but preventing credit card fraud. Although the latter might have been more profitable. So, I'm joking. So I think it would be useful to just give like a whistle-stop tour of how data works at Monzo. And this is, you know, essentially, I think data is generally done pretty well at Monzo. I've kind of come and been really happy with all the stuff I've seen. So, sorry, getting out of sync. So to start off with, we really just have one database. That database is Cassandra. Anyone that has any experience with Cassandra knows that it is not a database that you can kind of just select star from, you know, database where foo equals X. It's just, essentially it's stored in a way that means that you have to know what you're looking for when you get it. So from the very start, Monzo has been built in a way that emits events about state changes that happen in Cassandra to a queue. And then this essentially is like from the very start has meant that Monzo has been this kind of data, like every engineer had to be thinking about data engineering because otherwise they wouldn't really have a good idea of the changes that were actually happening in their application. So if you think about these JSON events, they're essentially event type, string, timestamp, and a payload, which is just a kind of schemaless to the reader blob of JSON. So let's see if this works. So we have, quite frankly, a ludicrous number of microservices running on Kubernetes at the moment. So we have over 1,000 backend services. These are essentially connected to a queue called NSQ, which is just, you post JSON onto it and it's sort of every service can consume from there. We also have two client apps that are emitting analytics events directly to an API, and then we take that data from the API and post that onto NSQ. So you can think of this as like a fire hose of analytics events that is just sort of constantly streaming through. These are then ingested into BigQuery in real time. So essentially just imagine a service that consumes from this queue and it's just writing these three schemaed things. So event type, timestamp, JSON blob, putting that into BigQuery. So there's nice things about that. It takes seconds from something actually happening to it being available in BigQuery for analysis. So what do we do with it then? We then use Airflow. We run some scheduled SQL and some cron jobs on that data. And then Looker and a bunch of other stuff consumes the output. But today we're mostly going to be thinking about Looker and analysis. So who uses data at Monzo? Lots of people. So we have roughly 25 product analysts now. So these are directly embedded in product teams. They are kind of responsible for taking these events that might be something like a message from MasterCard on the MasterCard network, or a withdrawal from an account that we have, or it might be someone signing up for the app. And they're taking all of these like lower level events and creating abstractions for people to sort of understand them as transactions, users, accounts, etc. So the embedded model works really well. Essentially, these are the people that are owning the data and are sort of closest to the events and have the most knowledge. And they're helping product teams figure out what they should be doing next, reporting what they've done, et cetera, et cetera. But in general, we have hundreds of people that are interested in doing stuff with data. So that's, I think it's a difference between like being in the data team but wanting to do productive things with data. And ultimately, we want this group of people to be as large as possible. So if you think about finance people, they want to do good forecasting, right? So they need to be able to be savvy with the data, trust the data, and be able to sort of push that hopefully into a system where other people can consume that. Product managers, very much the same. We want to empower these people and steer them in the right direction. So essentially they're using good patterns and ways that leverage the infrastructure that we already have. So we have hundreds of users of Looker. One stat that's really nice is 70% of our Looker users are weekly active. So there's really high engagement in Looker as a tool. And the CEO is actually one of the most prolific users of Looker, which is really cool to get it, directly from the top. Essentially, this focus on the very fundamentals of sort of like the business from a data perspective, but everyone from product, investors, engineers, operations use Looker to get their jobs done. We have nearly 1,000 employees right now. So this is not really like, this is a meaningless number sort of in and of itself, but it shows you that we're working at a scale where we can't really do like hero-driven development anymore. Like you can't just go and change all of the things because there's simply just too many things for one person to change. You have to build sort of systems that then, good practices that push people in the right direction to essentially make this change happen. And that's something that we'll be discussing when we're talking about moving to DBT. So we are going to move to DBT, and this talk is really discussing about how we're doing that. But I think it's important to figure out where we're coming from at the moment. So essentially, we just have SQL files and Airflow at the moment. We stitch these together manually. So you specify the dependencies that your query depends on, and we'll make sure that those run for you. It works. It's a little error prone. I would say the analysts are mostly comfortable with SQL and a little bit with Python. So writing the Python side of stuff is more just trying to get something working as opposed to like building it in sort of a software engineering way. And like with most things in startups, there's not really like a conscious decision why things are the way they are. They were just there when there was a person of one and no one's changed them. And now there's 50 people using it and it doesn't really fit anymore. And migrations are really the only sole way out of doing things, of like getting out of this tech debt. There's not really, I don't think, another way that's suitable. So why would we migrate to DBT? So one thing that's really important for us is for analysts to be super productive. So faster development is really key for us. So one thing that we really like is being able to automatically sample a small subset of data and then being able to test all of the downstreams. We don't have that capacity at the moment because we're just referencing raw BigQuery tables. Being able to sort of parameterize this stuff and take it out when we're doing sort of local development environment testing is super useful. And then analysts can't really run Airflow locally. It's pretty heavyweight. Like you have to get a bunch of stuff set up. You have to run SQLite and all of these things. If we just use DBT, then you just have to run Python and everything kind of sort of works. So increased reliability. Right now we have a custom way of doing like validation testing on the data we have. DBT makes this super cheap. So we really like that. Centralized knowledge. This is like thinking about the systems and the processes that help businesses scale. So one of the challenges we're hitting is a lack of shared understanding of what does this thing actually mean? Like what is the computation that's gone into making this thing? And like, it's very nice that occasionally people will be super nice and write a comment above the thing saying, oh yeah, it's actually this thing divided by this thing. But you can't really pass that, as a machine. Like it's hard to understand that relationship. And it's hard to propagate that sort of stuff to any other systems that would be useful. So like Looker or BigQuery, we just haven't built that and it's challenging to do. Centralized knowledge is really important to pointing non-technical people. So one of the things that people often do is like, oh, if you just want to look at how something is calculated, just go to GitHub and figure it out. Well, like your product manager doesn't have a GitHub account, like a lot of the time. So it kind of like, it sounds trite, but like it does start to breed a culture of sort of us and them, and like the engineers or the data analysts now have more knowledge that's centralizing in their heads when there's ultimately no really good reason why that should be the case. And it's more powerful if it's not the case. And I talked a bit about machine readability. So if you think about tags in DBT, they're super powerful. So if you could just tag things with dimensions like, tag it with like needs refactoring, for example. Let's say you spot something horrible in the code and you just think you want to improve it. Well, if you tag it with needs refactoring, you can then say, okay, this percentage of this key DAG that I have is actually built, on top of Cruft that we need to figure out. We also use this for PII, so tag things that contain PII, and we can sort of propagate that to figure out what parts of things are relying on PII. And just like having this really lightweight ability to annotate things is really powerful. Machine readability in comments is really cool as well. So like when we launch with DBT, we probably won't have much CI checks on things like documentation, but you can imagine over time, we might say that like, okay, if you're implementing a MART model, then 20% of the fields of your model must be documented. And then over time, that could be 40%, 60%, sort of driving this gradual improvement in data quality without having to do it ourselves. Okay, so enough talking, let's actually get down to some code. So how are we going to do the migration? Essentially, we're going to use automation as much as possible. So this is something that we've been working on. So if you remember earlier, I said we have thousands of base events, well, thousands of events that go to this JSON stream, and we're calling these base events. So in BigQuery, this is the syntax for extracting a field out of a JSON payload. And as you saw, this is unschemed. Like we don't really know what's in here a priori. So we have this whole file here is automatically generated by a script. So the analyst just says, please generate me a new base event, and this all sort of works. So at the top, because this was coming from a particular, this is a BigQuery project ID, this doesn't contain PII, so we're able to tag it that it doesn't contain any PII. Here's some stuff that we might use for incremental builds at some point in the future. So we get the max insertion timestamp from the table. We then run a query that does self-introspection of all of the JSON keys that have been posted in the event. And then we extract those out here. So we sort of explode this JSON payload out into a wider table, which is really cool. So the analyst doesn't have to sort of go through clicking and adding things. We have this little macro here, which is super powerful. It essentially does a select from the underlying table, but underneath it, we check to see if we're running in the development environment. And if we are running in a development environment, we then sample just the last day's worth of data and up to 10,000 rows. So a query, if you think about all of the transactions that ever went through Monzo, there is a lot of them. But if we can keep the same representation, like the columns that are being used, the tables that depend on, but only use, say 100,000th of that data, then stuff gets really snappy. People can start testing things locally. It gets really, really nice. And then we have this little limit function at the bottom that essentially just limits it to 10,000 rows. So like I said, analysts don't need to work on any of this stuff. We'll just generate them all for all of the events that we have, and people can pass them out. When we have new ones, analysts can add them themselves if they like, or we can just have a background job that's essentially syncing the state of our Git repo with the backend state. So we also want to make sure that using DBT feels like sort of a multiplicatively better experience than what they have right now, given that we're asking them to take on extra work to migrate stuff. And I think that's something that we've been thinking about a lot is how to make that happen. So I don't think I've actually told the people at Fishtown yet, but we actually forked DBT and have added some things to it. I hope they won't be too mad. So what we have here, you can't really see it on here, but we have a command in DBT, which is dbt Monzo helpers shell, and that will create a new shell for you on the command line that annotates the data set that you're working within, and then whether you have development sampling turned on for your particular project. So this is really nice because it gives the analyst confidence that they're not accidentally running something against production and they're sort of going to blow up the bank. And it also means that they have a good idea of like, is this going to be fast or not, essentially. Because this is a bit of a key worry is like the analysts want to make sure that they're not having a negative impact on anything else, which is sort of allowing them to go faster. So here's that here's that command that I was talking about. Again, you can't really see it. Sorry about that. So this generates that new base event that I was talking about a couple of slides ago. You just essentially put your event name in here. We run the query, we output a model, you sort of get working. The other stuff that we've added is dry runs are really useful in BigQuery, so you don't pay for dry runs, but they will do all of the checking of the schema for you. So you can essentially dry run your entire DAG, which will basically check that, like, would this SQL run if I were to run it in not dry run mode? And that's really handy because we can then use that as like a quick acid test for analysts to just run it. And like, we can, run over hundreds of models in like 10 to 15 seconds, which is super powerful. I think DBT used to have this and they took it out because they weren't entirely happy with the design or how it was implemented. I think it's worth saying that, like, if there was a plugin architecture in DBT, like you could just add commands to like add these sort of subcommands, we'd totally love to like contribute this back or generally help out there. But I think the other option we had for this was do a bunch of magic with Bash and other commands and Python, and we really wanted people, because they really like DBT, to sort of stay within DBT land. So that's why we've decided to sort of centralize on using DBT there. So like, also talking about the mechanics of migrating, when we started thinking about this, we decided that it would be a failure if the data engineering team did a large amount of the migration. Essentially, that would mean that we hadn't convinced people that it was good enough to move. And like I said, we don't want to go towards this sort of hero-driven development where we're like slogging extra hours to get stuff over the line. We want analysts to be super bought into this. So what we've done is like over-communicated massively. So Monzo is sort of an amazing user of Slack. Everything happens in Slack. So we've created loads and loads of Slack channels for people to sort of jump in, get help, et cetera, et cetera. We did getting started guides, tutorials, real life migration guides, where we actually took a thing from the old system, ported it all the way over to the new system, and did this like running commentary of like the thought process of what was going on when we did that. And at the moment, we have such a large team that like investing the week of human time that it takes to write up these docs, if you think about all the people that we have at the moment, plus all the future people we will hire, like the payoff is totally worth it. I think migrations only really work if you can do them incrementally. The software world has moved drastically away from doing things in a big bang fashion, like switch over, to doing things in an incremental fashion. So you have incremental deploys, incremental pull requests, feature flag rollouts, et cetera, et cetera. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't take inspiration from that and do that with migrations as well. So we use Airflow and SQL right now. We have built tooling that essentially integrates a hybrid Airflow model with a DBT model. So we can sort of port over a model at a time, assuming that the model names are the same, and have all the dependencies sort of stitch up perfectly. So we don't have to cut over one day from, tens of thousands of lines of code in one system to tens of thousands of lines of code in the other system. We can just do it incrementally, which is really nice. And like Airflow, to me, feels like a very heavyweight tool for an analyst to use. It just doesn't seem like something that they should be interested in when trying to do their day jobs. It's far too low level, I think. So if you just want to run some SQL, which is like 90% of the use cases, you really don't need to know anything about Airflow, and that's what we're aiming for here. So we're using tags. So you just tag your model with hourly. We will then take all the models that are running hourly and essentially run them on Airflow for you, so you don't have to worry about any of that. We haven't got rid of Airflow totally, so the UI is really useful for retrying tasks. Some of our stuff takes many hours to run overnight, and we want to be able to only run the things that we need to when things inevitably fail. So I heard a really good quote recently, which was like, you don't truly understand an idea until you can like explain the bad points about it. And I think that's very true here. So like there's some stuff I'm really worried about doing this migration. So if you think about SQL and data models right now, kind of asking people to learn a lot more software engineering principles. And I think that's a steeper curve to people. If you think about good software engineering skills, a bunch of them are around like design, abstraction, decoupling, information hiding. These are not easy concepts, and we're sort of, to some extent, asking people to learn them when they're already very busy. So I think I'm wondering, are we just making the bar a bit higher so we might have less contributors to our repository in the future and they will be probably of a higher quality? Or am I kind of overfitting to my own software engineering mindset and thinking that this is good and other people are just a bit too scared to say, no, you're wrong. Like this is not the right way to do it? Because I truly believe that it is, but it might be the case that it's not. Also somewhat skeptical that the analysts will pick up like the more powerful features. Powerful not in the sense of like being shiny or really cool to use, but things that are the more software engineering principles of DBT. So this would be around macros, reusing things, functions. I'm somewhat skeptical that they will pick those up without sort of encouragement from me, but I'll do my best. And then like, yeah, reusing stuff. SQL is a language that I think is like probably one of the most important languages that democratizes and makes people more productive at work. But it is not a great programming language to build really super robust systems in without having these guardrails in place. I think DBT testing definitely does some of those guardrails, but like people haven't come to SQL having been software engineers. They're coming to SQL just wanting to get something done. And essentially trying to get them to think about reuse functions, etc., is potentially something that might not happen, but I keep my fingers crossed. And with that, thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Cool. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask James to come up, and we're going to try to take a stab at any questions you have or anyone on the internet has that may have posted in the Slack channel. You're no longer lapelled, so we're going to hang around. We're going to pass this mic around. Before I go to the audience, I'm going to be selfish. And Stephen, you touched on this a bit in yours, but we've got some of the Fishtown guys watching. And so the question to both of you is, if there was one feature that you'd want DBT to have that it doesn't currently have, what would it be?
So I think I've talked to Drew a bunch. It's like I've talked to them, and they're kind of pushing DBT in perhaps the way it doesn't want to go. But like right now, I view that most people that are going to be running DBT are probably moving from something like Airflow, and making that incremental move easier, I think would help. Or running DBT nicely in part of a scheduler. So what we've had to do is kind of use some of what we need to get out of DBT is the models and the order in which it would have run the models itself, so we can make those Airflow tasks. And we sort of had to hack into the DBT API a bit to do that. But I'm gonna be very nice here. They're like doing a great job. So just like honestly, just keep doing like all the BigQuery stuff that they did recently with like adding documentation. That's really powerful for us. Test severity was really cool. So it's fine. Just keep doing it.
I think it's fine. Yeah, that's it basically.
Cool. Any audience questions? Yeah. No. Yeah.
Should I just stand up?
Yeah. Apparently.
You can shout at this mic top.
Apparently, you just shout at the ceiling, and everyone will hear it.
No. So I wanted to ask, when you deal with DBT projects, and obviously it's a great way to structure your transformations and so on, but you also have Airflow for orchestration. Have you already adopted any best practices around how exactly you slice and dice your project so that your transformation over here is in DBT, but your orchestration happens through Airflow? Do you invoke entire projects in DBT through Airflow nodes in your DAG, or do you call certain models, or how do you kind of orchestrate the whole thing?
So I think the question, to the extent that it needs to be repeated for anyone on the internet, is like, how do you structure your DBT and Airflow projects so that they play nicely together?
So when we first started out, we were quite naive and we thought, we'll just have a DAG for each model, basically. We'll separate, we'll say when we want it to run, and that'll be fine. But very quickly that becomes quite unmanageable because you're just building more and more models. So moving to the method that Stephen talked about before, where you're tagging models and running things on tags, but it is difficult working with Airflow and DBT. So yeah, it's something that's going to be ongoing, iterative, and just improving.
Thanks. I would say we've been like somewhat unimpressed with the reliability of Airflow, or at least the way that we're running with it. So in a perfect world, I would just love to use DBT for everything. But the problem is we need to kick off like cron jobs that happen once the table is updated. So what we're doing at the moment is essentially keeping Airflow really dumb. So it knows to run, like essentially we have a utility library that we pass arguments to, like essentially model selectors down through to DBT. And then all Airflow does is actually stitch those things together and then runs a set of bash commands out. So there isn't really a huge amount going on in Airflow. I think that's the way that we would like to keep it. Like one problem that we've seen with Airflow is it doesn't seem to know when the processes that itself is running have stopped. So you have these jobs that are hanging for like 12 hours and then nothing runs, people complain, and Theo, who's sitting somewhere in the audience, has built like a separate service that kills things on Airflow because it doesn't know when it's, yeah, sorry, I could rant for a very long time about Airflow.
Cool. Any other questions?
Oh, okay. Dear God. Do you have any experience scaling DBT to a large number of different groups? And the question behind this being, I'm in an organization where I have like maybe 8 or 10 different teams who are going to potentially contribute independently to this. And I'm interested to know, like, do you have all of this on one project or multiple sort of satellite projects that somehow roll up into one? Did you give any kind of like architectural guidelines of how people should contribute to that sort of stuff beforehand?
Mine's quite quick. So we haven't done any migration yet, so we don't have experience scaling that, but what we have done is thought a lot about the architectural side of stuff. So mostly around like what models are, so like base staging, like all of these sorts of things, and being very clear in those definitions. I think that one of the key benefits that we want to get out of DBT is better structure. So we've like really kind of gone hard on that, but no experience doing any of the other stuff.
So similar. We've started with one project, but we don't think that is going to be the case forever. I read something on the discourse about having like using projects as libraries effectively, which I think might be a very useful thing to do. And yeah, basically, yeah, you're going to be constantly looking at how to structure things basically, because I think it might get quite unwieldy after a while.
We've got one question from the internet, which is for Stephen, which is from Josh Temple. Curious to know how you randomly sample limited records in BigQuery without scanning the whole table.
So we do the partitioning first. So we only, all of the underlying tables in BigQuery are partitioned. So what that means for those that don't use BigQuery is that is your way to control the data that you scan when you look at it, because BigQuery doesn't have indexes. So if you don't partition your tables by default, it scans everything. Super expensive, takes a long time. So for development sampling, we only ever take the last day, and then the limit is really just like the cherry on the cake. The actual partitioning is the thing that's doing the useful work there. So. That was really impressive.
Any more questions?
Stephen, the worries you had at the end, based off of what you've seen so far in setting up the migration you're about to do and the people you have tested it with, what are the initial signs you've seen about whether those worries are going to play out or not?
That's a good question. So there was a Slack conversation today about how do I pivot a table by, some column and like explode it to all, so if you have like a set of t-shirts and it's like red, green, blue, you want to go from that to columns being red, green, blue, and counts, etc. And like they were having this conversation about writing SQL queries to generate the SQL query to paste in to replace the original SQL query. And it was really nice just to be able to say like, in the magical future, you know, here's the function that you would use in DBT to do that. And sort of instantly people kind of figured out that, right, like maybe I don't understand right now how I would use this, but the benefit seems like disproportionately large that they will invest the time in doing it. We've sort of done one lunch and learn on DBT so far, and people have been really interested in that side of stuff. So, like, cautiously optimistic, I think.
Almost the exact same experience whereby somebody wanted a string splitter, so we're able to say, well, just you wait, in a few months you'll have DBT and there's a function to do that already there for you. But the thing you mentioned about the learning curve, it is something I'm concerned about as well, because we are basically, it's not just using DBT, but it's like, you're using the command line, using Git, using it's not like common to a lot of people basically, and you do need to remember that when you're trying to foist it upon them.
Yeah, question for Steve. When you use the data sample to do the development and testing, is it some data you take from production and do some anonymization, and do you use any tools, or the DBT can handle that kind of thing?
Yeah, so we run stuff against production. I think there's two schools of thought on this. Like you could have a staging environment and spend a long amount of time ensuring that your staging environment perfectly matches production. Ultimately, it will never happen. I've been in companies that have tried to do that. And we also use Google Drive to pull into BigQuery. So we would also have those issues of like a business user that wants to input something into BigQuery now has to create a staging version of that. And like, they don't care about doing any of that. So what we've decided to go down is the route where we sample from production. Everyone gets their own isolated development environment. They can create stuff, blow it up, do exactly what they want there. In terms of PII stuff, nothing is ever touching the raw machine. So it's all going to our locked down PII project anyway. So we're not so worried about that. But yeah, I think that has been one of the biggest impact things for us. It's like that has unlocked so many other things. Like people will test things and people will actually run them. We can run them in CI because it doesn't take as long to do it, and it sort of unlocks all of these other good practices that then set you on this like nice curve going to better code quality, I think.
I'm actually going to add a bit there, which I think the bit that Stephen's just talked about like everyone having their own development environment in like one production database and just being able to write to a new schema, like pushes people to test. It also means that you can start testing upstream stuff or downstream stuff rather, like really nicely. So if you use Looker, you use Mode, there's lots of things you can do that mean that they can run your whole Looker instance looking at the schema of data that they've just run in like their DBT environment. And that just means that like you can test stuff all the way through. And the opposite of that is like you hope you like try to plan the change upstream, you push the change, it happens in production, you try to make sure that you like push the Looker pull request and it just like becomes chaos. And I think like that ability to push into like give everyone their own development environment all using the same data is like incredibly powerful, and actually people don't talk about that much.
Have any of you built any mechanism that would validate this if a SQL change, for instance, broke the way a specific business KPI is being calculated? So, for instance, an attribution model that an engineer goes there, changes the SQL, and it's not related to the attribution model, but now it's broken.
So it's a short answer, no. But it is on our radar. So the DBT allows you to write data tests basically. So we had an example in the pricing team where they just stopped receiving receiving nulls basically in a column they weren't expecting. So yeah, I sold DBT on the basis that we will be able to test for these things. So we could write tests within DBT to check for certain things, or things that not just not null or whatever, but actually data validation and just checking that things are as we expect them to be. I think that's going to be really, really powerful, but we've not written them yet.
If it makes any difference, we have. It's nuts. It's amazing. the most helpful test was just, we have a test that runs that checks the number of orders we thought we had every month last year.
Mhm.
And that checks that that is always the same. Because last year it was already happening.
That's cool.
And that's caught multiple errors.
Just, sorry, I just had like not a specific experience, but we're always trying to think about how can we make powerful testing more intuitive and cheap. So one thing that we have is like we have these audit tables. So we insert sort of pre-operation counts, times, users, etc., and then post-operation counts of rows. And like one powerful thing is like this table size should monotonically increase over time. That will catch a very large percentage of like, oh, why are there no orders anymore? Well, it's because like, you know, this thing that used to be 1 million is now 0. And having that as like, having that in like CI, I think is really powerful because you can sort of catch it before it goes out. But yeah, big fan.
We're going to go to Danny at the back, who's had his hand up the whole time.
Thank you. So there's quite a bit of overlap now between Looker and DBT in terms of functionality. I was wondering, how do you use each tool and whether you reference them at all between each other? Say, Looker Explore referencing to DBT model, or the other way around, or something like that?
So I think our preference, although I'm not the best person to speak to about it, is to kind of treat Looker as the final select statement and not really keep any logic in there. I think over time, as stuff becomes more machine readable, like documentation and schema, we might push more things into this layer that's underneath Looker, underneath BigQuery, that pushes things. You know, we can generate all of your LookML for you, for example. If you annotate things in the schema, we can figure out that this is actually foreign key to some other thing, and we can do that join in Looker. So I think we decided not to do fancy stuff in Looker. I'm not sure of the reason why, but it seems like a good call.
He already knows why.
Yeah, I guess add to that, I think a lot of projects we end up working on end up like having almost a one-to-one relationship for like a DBT model and this like modular thing that you can play around with in Looker, and then you let people do that like last mile bit of like joining with the right tables and all of that stuff in Looker, but hold very little logic in there. I think the one instance where we do put a lot of logic is if like user input is needed for a query, and so you like find the balance of typically putting as much as you can in the DBT model and then doing that like really last bit of transformation where a conditional filter, like a templated filter, anything like that is required in Looker or whatever other tool you're using, and like keeping it that way, because for all the same reasons, like if you have that really close relationship, you can push documentation up and down and all of those things, which plays very nicely.
I think that's the point as well, is how we're thinking about it quite a lot. Where's the place? If someone's in Looker, do they then go to DBT to read about the model, or is the documentation stored in both places, or somewhere more centrally? So we're trying to work that out at the moment, but I think it's an ongoing.
Cool. We've got another one from the internet, from Claire, who has asked, what can we, by we I think she means DBT and Fishdown, do on the community front to make the learning curve a bit less steep?
I'm gonna start with.
I don't know. The documentation's really good. So the learning curve for me is when I'm setting up terminal and I'm setting up GitHub keys, SSH keys, and everything. So I just basically tell them to ignore what I'm doing on the computer, and it will all be up and running soon. So yeah, I think it's just the nature of getting into that. And I think Claire actually made the point before on one of the posts that if people have been using Looker as well, they kind of learned a lot of bad Git habits and stuff that it's hard to break out of. But yeah, I mean, the documentation is really good. I direct everyone to the Slack channel as well. Yeah, it's hard to pick fault with that, to be honest. I think it's just the nature of it.
Yeah, I echo everything he said.
Yeah, what I would say is I think like for people who come from the software engineering way, it often works. Like they get it really quickly. And if they're going the other way, it's not DBT they have a problem with. It's like, it's how does Git work? It's how does command line work? Shit, I'm on a Windows machine and I need to figure out how to install Python, which I'm told is about to get easier. But and so I think like providing, it doesn't need to be part of the docs, but like providing resources to those things for people who are just starting and walking through, I think would be a useful thing. Like in my work, I work with a bunch of clients who do all this stuff, and I spend more of the like training piece and the documentation being like, here's terminal, here's how you like, and like resources for tons of things. A lot of what we do is like, they've never used terminal before, and so they have no idea how to, that they can change their terminal, and that their terminal is a thing that is like customizable to them, and that they can like make their workflow much, much easier. And like, it's not Fishtown's job or DBT's job to like teach that to everyone, but I think like making people aware, I think a lot of people come to DBT from that direction, and making people aware that that's a thing that like they don't know the questions to ask to start with.
Yeah, that point about sort of workflows is really interesting. So I use VS Code to edit code, and I use this thing, it's Command P a lot. So it's fuzzy text search over the files that are in the folders that you have open. So I can fuzzy text search like base underscore, 3D secure or something, and like all of the 3D secure models are instantly there for me. I figured out the other day, like almost none of the analysts know that this even exists. So what they're doing is clicking into folders to find all of this stuff because they simply just haven't been shown like the way that is a lot easier to do. Same with like Control R in Bash, where you can just search backwards through your whole Bash history. People just don't know about this stuff. And if we're trying to get them to kind of jump into the software engineering mindset, I think that would be really powerful. Is like, how can you make using DBT within favorite text editor terminal of choice like a really easy and nice experience, I think.
I had that exact same experience where I was working with an analyst where like all of our import models are at the top. And so I'll often go to an import model, double click on it, Control C, Command C, Command P, Command V, enter. And it's just like you're immediately in that model, and it blows people's mind. And they just like, they don't know how to ask the question. And so I think like.
I think yesterday as well.
Yeah.
Global search.
There you go. So any other questions? Cool. Let me just double check that there aren't any here. And we did it. That's it, everyone. Can I get another round of applause for our two speakers? Final thank you is absolutely to Simply Business, who have like sorted the food, put on the venue, had us in their awesome offices. You guys may not be able to see this on the Zoom call, but these offices are great. And thank you finally to all of you who have like come out on a Thursday night, on a balmy London summer night, to come talk DBT, and we really appreciate it. This is the second one of these. We're gonna try to do them every 2 months or so. So end of August, assuming not everyone has left London on holiday. So keep an eye out on Meetup. But again, thank you very much. We really appreciate everyone coming out and supporting. And it's been a great evening. Thank you again to everyone. And thank you to everyone on the Zoom. Great to have you involved.